But where we are going to start is there finally going to be relief at the supermarket. The government has unveiled plans to speed up the regulatory process companies need to go through to get supermarkets built in New Zealand. Economic Growth Minister Nicola Willis says the government's proposed changes will reduce the time it takes to get consent to build a supermarket from 18 months to less than a year. She is still exploring whether to require the country's two grocery giants, Woolworths and Foodstuffs, to sell off their assets. These companies exercise, as we know, a huge amount of power, both in the wholesale and retail spaces. So the consenting changes the government's decided to make include clarifying grocery developers' eligibility for a fast-track approval process, establishing a single building consent process for supermarket developments, and removing restrictions to use multi-proof for faster building consents of standardised designs. Basically, this is just skipping some of the usual delays and get things faster built. Ernie Newman has extensive background in the grocery and telecommunications and business advocacy sectors, and it's good to have him back on the show. G'day, Ernie.
Hi, Leah. How are you?
I'm good, my friend. Thank you again for being available. Love having a chat about this with you. All right, Minister Willis is hoping an express lane for supermarkets will yield more competition. Before we get into the negatives, Ernie, were there any positive features here that you saw?
Yeah, there were one or two. I think the fact that she put out an olive branch to the duopoly and suggested they might like to work with the government and come up with some kind of separation formula themselves. I think that's a really positive move, except that she will need to be very careful that the government doesn't get gamed on that. Because to be quite honest, these supermarkets are pretty wily people and probably a lot smarter than the public servants.
Yeah.
And far better resource. That's the reality, they're far better resource.
Sure.
So that was good. And there was stuff about predatory pricing and that sort of thing. Well, predatory pricing is absolutely endemic all over this industry. And quite frankly, it should have been stamped out years ago. So that's, it's good that she's acknowledged that, but, a bit late to the party.
Yeah. Explain predatory pricing for us again, Ernie.
That's where you adjust your prices locality by locality depending on the competition. So if you get, one particular competitor that comes in in a small country town, for example, and you want to take them out, you drop your prices in that town, but you don't drop them over the rest of the country where you're not facing that sort of competition. In most jurisdictions, that's fundamentally, if you've got substantial market power like the supermarkets have, that's fundamentally against the rules, and we need to come down a lot harder on that sort of thing. So good that she's acknowledged that, but it should have been there all along.
Yeah. And just quickly before we move on to, what the other points of it. So, the big players like Foodstuffs and Woolworths, I mean, yeah, you said it's quite good that the minister's kind of presented an olive branch, and that they could come up with some of the solutions themselves. Do you really think realistically, though, to trust them to fix a problem that's on their own? Isn't it the fox and the henhouse situation?
Yeah, you can argue that, and I think I probably agree with you. But that's a situation they brought on themselves, There are some industries that we trust, there are some industries that we don't. And I think New Zealand's experience in the various markets over the last few years is that the supermarkets are one industry that we don't trust. So they have to earn that trust back. And working with the government to find some way through this to sort out this price gouging would be a really good way to do that. Whether it'll work, I don't know, but good that the minister has put the invitation on the table.
Is the issue here, Ernie, that it's not that we don't have enough supermarkets, or is it the ones that we have are owned by too few?
That's exactly the issue. It's the second one. And that's my main criticism of where Nicola Willis has gone with this announcement. She's a bit fixated on getting more supermarkets into play. Now, we don't need more supermarkets. We haven't got quite the OECD average in terms of number per capita. but we're not far short of that. But the problem is not having too few supermarkets. It is that concentration of ownership in too few hands. Now, that comes back to regulatory failure over the years. I mean, with hindsight, we should never have let Woolworths buy Foodtown about 20 years ago, because at that point we had effectively 3. That took us down to 2. And there's lots of economic evidence that 3 is the magic number where you get some sort of competition. With 2, they just play games and pretend to compete, but they've worked out long ago that they're better to settle for the market share they've got and maximise their profits rather than fight each other for market share.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So 3 is kind of the magic number for competition. Not good in a marriage, Ernie, but good for competition.
Yeah, well, that's true. I don't think this is quite like a marriage, though. There are days where I certainly don't feel like I'm wedded to my supermarket. No way.
Can you explain what land banking is and why it frustrates new entrants?
Yeah. So land banking, I mean, in an industry like supermarkets, it's all about big shops, big stores. You can't compete against a major supermarket with a corner dairy. So you need a big site where you can stock, several thousand different product lines. Land banking land banking in this context is where the existing operators will look around a particular city or suburb or regional town, identify all the sites that are suitable for a new supermarket to be built, and buy them up and just leave them doing nothing. They just either leave them empty or put in a car yard or something like that, so that a new entrant has got nowhere to build. And that's been going on for years in New Zealand. The supermarkets did acknowledge this a couple of years ago. They were fined something for it by the Commerce Commission. I think it might have been $2.50 or something of that sort of order, and they promised to be good in future. But the damage is done because over a critical period of the last 20 years, that has stopped another chain coming in.
And we talked about penalties. What did the government's current penalties for anti-competitive behaviour, are they strong enough, Ernie, or not?
Nowhere near. The last one that I remember, I think was foodstuffs were given a penalty by the Commerce Commission, which was sort of something like half a day of their excess profit. No, the penalties are nowhere near good enough. But the penalties are the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. What we need to do is stop these behaviours happening in the first place. But most importantly, we need to rewind to where we were before all this anti-competitive behaviour started. We need to make an opening for a third chain by opening up some of the infrastructure that we currently have.
All right. So do you think, Ernie, then the government could either underwrite a new player or break up the current supermarkets? Are either of these realistic options or just too risky?
Yes, the second one is breaking up the existing chains. And people sort of, look at you sideways when you say this, but, I come from the days when telecom was a monopoly that was charging people the most expensive prices for mobile phones and landlines in the whole of the OECD. And the governments in that time, and we're talking here about the 2000s, both Labor and National had the courage to go in against exactly the kind of opposition that these supermarkets are putting up now and say, no, enough is enough. We are breaking that industry up. So they split what was then telecom into Chorus, which is the wholesale arm, and Spark, which is the retail arm. Now, New Zealand has never looked back from that point in telecommunications. We've now got 100-odd companies from various parts of the country from whom you can buy a phone service, and we've got pricing that is competitive by most OECD standards. So we've done very, very well at that. If we can do it in telecommunications, we can do it in the supermarket trade too.
You're talking breaking up the wholesale from the retail? Is that what we're talking about?
There's two options, Leah. Yeah. No, there are two options on the table. One is, yes, breaking up wholesale from retail. The other is to split what they call the banner groups. So banner groups is the industry jargon for New World, Pack and Save, Foursquare, Woolworths, etc. And at the moment, of course, there's one person effectively controls New World through Pack and Save and Foursquare, and another person who controls Woolworths and Fresh Choice. Now, if they were split up into completely separate companies with different boards and prevented by the Commerce Act from having any collusion among them, you would then get genuine competition. So you'd go to your local New World and they would be genuinely competing against Pack and Save instead of both reporting to the same Mr.
person.
Big down the road.
Gotcha.
So either of those options, retail split or wholesale from retail.
That would take legislative change, obviously, Ernie, because the government's poking its nose into private business.
Yes, but it's been done before. If the problem is big enough, and this problem clearly is big enough because, kids are starving because of this. People are going without meals. People are changing their diet.
Yep.
And the problem absolutely is big enough for the government to intervene in this one, yes.
What happened with the telcos when that happened, Ernie? Did they, obviously there was a pushback. Did they threaten? What happened? Did they threaten the government? What could they do?
Ironically not.